As a third-person shooter released in 2007, I thought I knew almost exactly what to expect from Kane Lynch, Dead Men. I expected the familiar gritty vocab of the 360 era, punctuated by over-the-shoulder action and maybe some sort of half-baked cover system. And to some degree, that intuition was pretty much on the money. But what I didn't expect to find was a game mired in controversy, and not the kind you'd usually expect. And long before anyone actually got their hands on it, Kane Lynch was at the center of a drama that threw the entire gaming industry into question, specifically involving advertising, reviews, and editorial independence. Definitely not what I expected, and surprisingly something that passed me by. Anyway, to put it all briefly, the publishers Eidos Interactive had a massive marketing agreement with a company called GameSpot, who were and still are a sizable gaming publication, known for reviews and whatever else these sorts of websites post. But when the review of Kane Lynch actually dropped, it didn't go exactly the way the publishers wanted, and the resulting fallout shattered public trust in gaming journalism and changed the landscape of the media, and permanently tied this game to corporate controversy, which obviously isn't ideal. The reviewer tasked with covering the game was Jeff Gerstmann, GameSpot's editorial director at the time. And he didn't pull any punches, giving the game a mediocre 6 out of 10, and in his video review he specifically targeted the game's core feel, calling the squad mechanics clunky and describing the actual shooting as loose and unimpressive. He argued that the story had promise, but the game was ultimately dragged down by a lot of technical hitches and a highly uncooperative cover system. And in fact, here's just the first few moments of his review, just so you can get a taste.
Kane Lynch Dead Men is an ugly, ugly game. That's not necessarily me talking just about the graphics. It's got a really ugly storyline with characters that are impossible to like, and it's a third-person shooter that has several gameplay flaws as well. Some really neat ideas are buried deep in there, but you're going to have to do a whole lot of digging, more than you'll probably want to do in order to find them.
So it goes without saying that Eidos weren't too pleased, having just spent probably hundreds of thousands of dollars to plaster GameSpot's website with Kane Lynch background ads. And although we don't know this for certain, it's probable that they threatened to pull all of their advertising budget because of the negative coverage. And fearing the loss of massive ad revenue, GameSpot's corporate management panicked, and instead of standing by their writer, capitulated to Eidos and fired Gerstmann on the spot. Later trying to claim that it was some sort of unrelated management decision, but the public obviously saw straight through it, and the blatant corporate interference sparked a massive user backlash and prompted several other high-profile editors to resign in protest, and exposed the fragile boundary between objective critique and corporate profit. But today, Kane Lynch faces a completely different problem, at least as far as I'm concerned, and I'm sure you've read the title. So yeah, it has indeed been quietly delisted on Steam since 2021, which apparently is temporary, but luckily you can still pick it up on GOG, so it ain't all that bad. But if you do manage to find a copy and play it now, you'll quickly realize that the real tragedy isn't the history of its reviews, but how it plays, hence the title. So it's actually a bit of a double entendre for those who are into that sort of thing. But anyway, on to the game, which is what you're all here for. And I do actually tend to echo most of Jeff's points, especially the ones about the game being ugly, and again, not just graphically. It is perhaps one of the most oppressively depressing tones for a game I can remember, at least in recent memory, and funnily enough, the constant arguing, swearing and friction between characters kinda reminds me of Yellowstone. And I don't know about you, but does anyone else think that that show is completely oppressive and it's always in some sort of battle state with all of the abrasive characters, or I don't know, there's always something really terrible going on, and there's kind of parallels between that and this. I don't know, is it just me? Let me know what you think. Well, anyway, what I'm trying to say is that Kane Lynch is tonally bleak. The characters are utterly irredeemable, and I think it's the first time I've actually stepped back and actually thought, these characters are just totally irredeemable and unlikable, and it's all laid on pretty thick, and it's about as subtle as, well, something that's not very subtle, if you know what I mean. Both Kane Lynch constantly argue, tell each other to fuck off, and just generally aren't the sort of guys you'd want to sit at the lunch table with, and they look it too. In an era dominated by chiseled, conventionally attractive leading guys like Nathan Drake or Commander Shepard, these two look like a couple of guys that you wouldn't want to cross on a dark night, and they look especially like the sort of guys you might expect to see on death row, which is obviously where they come from. And Kane even spends a massive portion of the game sporting this horrific broken nose, which somehow makes him look even meaner. But I gotta say, for as negatively charged as I've been up to this point, I do actually think that this is one of the things that the game does quite well. It actively subverts the usual tropes of playing as some sort of righteous, good-looking hero, and these guys aren't handsome, and they're certainly not heroes, not even anti-heroes, they're just bad guys. And in a medium that's usually forcing you to be the savior of the universe, it's definitely an interesting change of pace, I'll say that much. But where this all falls apart yet remains equally bleak is the actual gameplay. And I've got to say, I do actually think that Kane Lynch is one of the worst controlling games I've ever played. And no, I promise I'm not exaggerating, it really is that bad. Maybe I need to play more games, but goddamn, did this game test my patience. Reviews from the time usually mention how the gunplay feels floaty or unrewarding, and perhaps back in 2007 it was just considered a bit mediocre. But with a modern perspective on console, this level of feedback is frankly unacceptable in my opinion. I've played games that don't play well, and I've played games that handle player feedback poorly, but Kane Lynch just knocks it out of the park in pretty much every way possible, and it manages to deliver a feedback loop which isn't just unsatisfying, but actively works against you. It made me want to stop playing the game entirely, and if it wasn't for the fact of me making this video, I'd have probably dropped it within the first 10 minutes. It's really that bad, and I honestly can't believe it made it past the QA. Was it just not that bad back in 2007? I really don't know. Even if we cast aside the standard 2007 jank, your aiming here feels more like a suggestion, and your movement is imprecise, and your shots don't go where you expect them to. And worse yet, even when your shots do land, the game doesn't really give you any indication that they did. And when I say feedback, I mean what you see and feel as a player. When you tilt your analog stick to aim, it should feel tight and responsive. Instead, it feels sluggish and sloppy, and when you pull the trigger, it should feel visceral and consequential, like your bullets actually make a difference. But here it's completely uncertain and unsatisfying, and it's quite literally the exact opposite of everything that you'd want in a shooter. And it's one of those things which might be quite difficult to convey with gameplay footage or even my script, and one of those things that you're just going to have to experience for yourself. And regrettably, I do genuinely stand by my statement that this is one of the worst feeling games that I've ever played, perhaps the worst, which is really saying something, to be honest. I felt like I was entirely out of control of my actions, and that my inputs had no weight or consequence. Kane Lynch has the absolute opposite of what I would call tactility, and it feels like you're playing the game with oven mitts on or something. It's just really quite bad. And it's one of those rare games where I felt like I never actually got any better at it as I played. And it's the sort of game that fights you every step of the way right until the end, which I suppose if you wanted to be incredibly generous, you could call some sort of fourth wall breaking immersion tactic. Like, the bleak hopelessness and the complete irredeemable tone of the narrative is actively breaking through the screen and trying to infect your actual controller, ensuring that the gameplay matches the character's misery, or something like that. But I honestly don't think it's anything like that. It's not that clever, which is saying something really, because this was actually developed by IO Interactive. Yeah, IO Interactive. I know, right? It's kinda crazy. The same studio that brought us Hitman, Freedom Fighters, and have recently been trusted with the Bond IP. They're not just some obscure, since-dissolved 360-era studio. They're an active studio today, and by all accounts, making critically acclaimed games. So, in my opinion, it's absolutely baffling that this is the sort of tarnish that they have on their profile. I really struggle to make sense of it. Which leads me on to yet another dour and, needless to say, baffling feature. And honestly, I feel wrong even describing it as a feature. It's the cover system, less of a mechanic and more of a digital turd whose miasma somehow manages to outstink everything else I've already mentioned. Yeah man, the cover system really pissed me off, which, again, is saying something. It's one of those automatic systems where you don't actually press a button to trigger it. You just walk up to an object, and in an ideal world, the game safely assumes what you want to do. No, it doesn't. Kane Lynch has absolutely no idea what you want, and you'll spend the entire campaign wondering if this definitely cover-shaped, cover-smelling, probably covering tended wall is actually something that you can hide behind. Most of the time, Kane will just sort of crouch near it, sort of being cover, but not really, leaving his shoulder completely exposed while you accidentally shoot directly into the masonry, instead of the enemies that you want to shoot out. It's just god fucking awful, and I don't even want to talk about it anymore. So, you know what? Let's just move on to something else. Let's talk about the squad mechanics instead. And Jesus Christ, they're not much better either. So you don't actually spend the majority of the game in the simple Kane and Lynch duo. In fact, it starts out with you both being broken out of prison transport, and immediately you're accompanied by like 10 other guys, or the mercenaries, I suppose. And there are other parts of the campaign where you get this similar-sized sort of small army at your disposal, but for most of the campaign, it's Kane, Lynch, and a couple of other hired guns, shall we say. Usually 3 or 4 guys, maybe 5 at maximum, give or take. Anyway, all the AI for these allies is pretty piss poor, and I'm sure you're absolutely shocked to hear that. They'll stand around in the open, wander directly into the enemy's line of fire, and get downed constantly. And annoyingly, they don't revive each other. So it's always your job to run out into crossfire and pump them full of adrenaline. And if you don't, they bleed out and you get a mission failed screen because one of them died and you have to go back a checkpoint. So the AI is constantly causing you to replay sections of the game because they just run out there and get killed, and that's even on the lower difficulties, which I found really, really frustrating because the game's already difficult enough because of the mechanics that I've already described. So while it's kind of nice to take control of a squad in the game because you can actually tell them to do things, all of your instructions, similar to the way the game controls, feel like a suggestion rather than a command. And you'll press the B button to make them follow you, and sometimes they just don't. And you can press Y, and that tells them to shoot at things. And again, sometimes they just don't. And there was even a couple of instances in the game where all of the squad has to be at the van to complete the mission. And for one reason or another, some of the squad just decided not to follow me, so I couldn't complete the mission. So I'm stood there smashing B, trying to get them to follow me, and they're just not. Yet again, an instance of Kane Lynch not allowing me to have my controller and make the buttons do what they do. The squad mechanics really are like an amalgamation of bad AI and bad game control, and the whole thing is just a complete mess. And honestly, it's the sort of thing that would stand out as the game's main flaw. And if it weren't for the god-awful controls and the digital turd of a cover system out stinking it, this would easily be the most annoying thing about the game. But impressively, I actually don't think it is. At its heart, this is a co-op game, so playing it solo forces me to deal with an AI companion who's so brain-dead that it almost made me want to drag in a complete stranger off the street to sit on my couch and play it with me. Because, yeah, that's the only way to play it in co-op, at least on console, which actually I quite like as a novelty, but convincing someone today to play a game like this is practically impossible. And I think Kane Lynch was entirely built around the assumption that you'd have a second player and not playing it alone. And I feel like I've missed out on the one way that this game might have been actually tolerable, because as we all know, bad games usually become fun when you're doing it with a friend. It's like a law of gaming physics or something. But anyway, let's round this all off by talking about the story, because I've not really touched on that yet. And I've already established that it was quite a bleak game, which it absolutely is. And for the most part, you'll consistently be reminded by how much of a terrible person both Kane and Lynch are. And the latter of which has these psychotic episodes where he'll completely black out, kill civilians, and just go completely crazy. And honestly, it's one of those rare nodes of positivity that I'll throw towards the game. I think the characters are actually somewhat interesting. Lynch has that entire psychological breakdown angle, and Kane is visibly worn down by years of guilt. And when you actually get downed as Kane, you'll hear all of his inner monologue or his thoughts, all of the voices that trouble him speaking all at once, and it's actually a pretty cool touch. Honestly, for two characters that lack so much humanity, it is actually quite humanizing in a weird sort of broken way, and on the whole, the writing isn't terrible, at least where the characters are concerned. Now, the story itself is pretty basic. You're essentially tasked with retrieving a stolen fortune for a crime syndicate called the Seven. And no, none of them can fly or laser people with their eyes. You're doing this to redeem yourself and save your family, but All of that goes to shit pretty quickly, and it spirals into a pretty run-of-the-mill revenge story where Kane is fueled by the murder of his wife, which, yes, you do actually see happen right in front of his teenage daughter. I really wasn't joking when I said this game was relentlessly bleak. But all that said, the story is fine. I don't consider it to be so bad that it's taking me out of the game in any way, at least not as much as the controls do, so I find this serviceable and totally something which is in line with what you might expect from a game of this era. So what really ruins it is the medium itself. I found it almost impossible to get genuinely invested in the narrative, regardless of how mildly interesting I thought the character dynamics were, because the controls are just a constant irritating barrier. In my opinion, Kane Lynch Deadman is just objectively a bad video game. It attempts some vaguely interesting things with its characters and its narrative tone, but every single ounce of that ambition is dragged down like an anvil by the actual gameplay. And I've got to say, I'm really not looking forward to playing Dog Days.